The rain pattered against the large glass windows of Newark International Airport as travelers rushed about, dragging suitcases and checking departure times. Among them was Michael Lee, the 45-year-old CEO of Ascension Tech, whose face wore the permanent frown of a man who believed the world was constantly failing to meet his standards. Michael checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. His flight to San Francisco had been delayed twice already, and his patience was wearing thinner than the hair he carefully combed over his receding hairline each morning. The notification on his phone had only made things worse. His assistant had booked him at the wrong hotel, one that Michael considered beneath his status. Incompetent, he muttered, typing a harsh message to his assistant. He didn't bother with pleasantries. In Michael's world, mistakes deserved punishment, not understanding. With 2 hours to kill before his rescheduled flight, Michael headed toward the exclusive Diamond Lounge, where the elite travelers could escape the noisy crowds. He flashed his platinum membership card at the attendant, who nodded respectfully, recognizing not just the card, but the expensive tailored suit and the air of importance Michael carried with him. Inside, the lounge was a sanctuary of soft lighting, comfortable seating, and quiet conversation. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. Michael headed straight for his favorite spot, a plush leather chair in the corner with a good view of both the runway and the television showing stock market updates. But someone was sitting there. Michael stopped, blinking in surprise. In his chair was a man who appeared to be in his late 30s, dressed in a plain gray hoodie, sweatpants, and worn sneakers. The man was reading something on his tablet, completely absorbed and unaware of Michael's glare. For a moment, Michael stood there, his mind struggling to process this disruption to his routine. In his world, people like this, people who didn't look like they belonged in first-class lounges, didn't take seats from people like him. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice louder than necessary. "I think you might be in the wrong area." The man looked up. He had kind eyes and a calm face that showed no immediate offense at the interruption. "I'm sorry." "This lounge," Michael continued, gesturing around with one hand while prominently displaying his platinum card with the other. "It's for Diamond members only. First-class passengers." The man's expression remained neutral. "Yes, I know." Something about the man's calmness made Michael even more irritated. He looked around, making sure other lounge patrons could hear him. "Look, the main terminal is downstairs. This area is reserved for premium passengers." "I understand that," the man said quietly, reaching for his own wallet. "I have a membership too." But Michael wasn't listening anymore. He'd already waved over a lounge attendant, a young woman who approached with a professional smile that faltered when she saw who was involved. "This person seems to have wandered into the wrong area," Michael said loudly, pointing at the man. "Could you please direct him to where he's supposed to be?" By now, several nearby passengers had stopped their conversations to watch. Some looked uncomfortable, others pretended not to notice, and a few were recording discreetly with their phones. The lounge attendant looked at the seated man. "Sir, may I see your membership card?" Without a word, the man produced a card identical to Michael's, the same platinum edge, the same exclusive diamond status. "Thank you, Mr. Washington," she said, recognizing the name. "Everything seems to be in order." Michael's face flushed hot with embarrassment that quickly converted to defensiveness. "Well, he certainly doesn't look like he belongs here," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. An older woman sitting at the next table made a disapproving noise. A businessman in a suit similar to Michael's suddenly became very interested in his laptop screen. Mr. Washington finally stood up. He was taller than Michael had realized. "Please take the seat," he said with dignity. "I was just leaving anyway." As Mr. Washington walked away, he maintained his composure, though his shoulders were tense. He nodded politely to the attendant and disappeared through the lounge doors. Michael sank into his now vacant seat, attempting to look pleased with himself despite the judging glances from other passengers. Little did he know that this brief encounter would return to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. 3 days after the airport incident, Michael arrived at the Ascension Tech headquarters in downtown San Francisco. The morning fog still clung to the glass skyscraper as he strode through the lobby, nodding briefly at the security guard who scrambled to hold the elevator door for him. "Good morning, Mr. Lee," his assistant Raj greeted him, rushing to keep pace as Michael walked briskly down the hallway. "The board is gathering in the main conference room. I've placed your notes on the table. Michael grunted in acknowledgement. Coffee. Already there. Black, no sugar, Raj replied, having learned Michael's preferences years ago. Today was important. After months of negotiations, Ascension Tech was being acquired by Horizon Ventures, a major investment firm known for turning promising tech companies into industry giants. The acquisition meant Michael would have new bosses to impress, but he wasn't worried. In his mind, they were lucky to have him staying on. Who's attending from Horizon? Michael asked, straightening his tie as they approached the conference room. The full executive team, Raj said, consulting his tablet. Their CEO is here personally to oversee the transition. Name? Mr. Washington. I don't have much background information yet, but he's... Michael cut him off. Doesn't matter. Just make sure the presentation is ready. He straightened his shoulders and put on the confident smile that had carried him through countless business deals. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy. Board members and top executives sat around the massive oak table, speaking in hushed tones. Financial reports and acquisition documents were spread across the polished surface. The wall of windows offered a spectacular view of the bay, now visible as the morning fog began to lift. Michael entered with the air of someone who owned the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, causing conversations to halt. Today marks a new chapter for Ascension Tech. I look forward to a smooth transition end. The words died in his throat as the door at the opposite end opened and a group of sharp-suited executives walked in. Leading them was a familiar face that sent a cold shock through Michael's body. It was him, the man from the airport lounge. The one Michael had tried to have removed. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit now instead of the hoodie and sweatpants, but his face was unmistakable. Sorry we're late, the man said, his voice smooth and authoritative. Traffic from the airport was heavier than expected. Richard Yang, Ascension's chief financial officer, rose to greet the newcomers. Not at all. We're honored to have you here. Everyone, I'd like to introduce the executive team from Horizon Ventures. Michael remained frozen in place as Richard continued, and this is their CEO, David Washington, who will be overseeing our integration into the Horizon family. David's eyes locked with Michael's across the room. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something that might have been amusement. Thank you, Richard, David said, setting his briefcase on the table. I'm looking forward to working with everyone at Ascension. His gaze never left Michael's face. Some of us have already had the pleasure of meeting. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Michael forced himself to move, to breathe, to function. He extended a hand that felt wooden. Mr. Washington. David's handshake was firm, his smile pleasant but knowing. Mr. Lee, what a surprise to see you again so soon. Richard looked between them, confused. You two know each other? We had a brief encounter at Newark Airport, David explained, releasing Michael's hand. Mr. Lee was quite concerned about who belonged in the first-class lounge. The room fell silent. Several board members exchanged glances. Well, David continued, taking the seat at the head of the table, Michael's usual place. Let's get down to business, shall we? As of 9 o'clock this morning, Horizon Ventures has completed its acquisition of Ascension Tech. There will be some changes, of course. He looked directly at Michael, starting with the leadership structure. Mr. Lee, I believe you, and I should schedule a private meeting after this. I have some thoughts about your role moving forward. Michael sank into the nearest chair, his legs suddenly weak. The room continued buzzing around him, but all he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears and the echo of his own voice at the airport. This person seems to have wandered into the wrong area. By the next morning, the story of Michael's airport encounter with David had spread through Ascension Tech like wildfire. Michael noticed the change the moment he walked into the building. The usual good morning, Mr. Lee from the receptionist was replaced with a quick nod and averted eyes. In the elevator, two marketing managers who normally chatted with him suddenly found their phones fascinating. Michael tried to convince himself it was nothing, just his imagination. But when he reached the executive floor and saw his assistant Raj whispering with another staff member, both immediately falling silent when they spotted him, he knew the truth. Everyone knew. Raj, Michael called, his voice sharper than intended. My office, now. Inside his glass-walled corner office, Michael dropped his briefcase on the desk with a thud. "What are people saying?" Raj shifted uncomfortably. "About what, sir?" "Don't play dumb." "About me and Washington." Raj hesitated, then sighed. "Someone from the airport posted a video. It's been shared among staff." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. "A video?" "Of the lounge incident. It doesn't show everything," but Raj trailed off. "But enough," Michael finished, collapsing into his chair. "How bad?" "People are mostly just surprised. No one said anything directly negative about you, but they're all thinking it," Michael said. He waved Raj away and stared out at the city skyline. For years, Michael had built his reputation on being tough, demanding, uncompromising. People feared him, and that fear had brought him respect, or at least what he had mistaken for respect. Now, for the first time, he realized how fragile that foundation was. At 11 a.m., the first executive meeting under Horizon's leadership began. Michael arrived exactly on time, not early as usual. He didn't want to be the first one in the room, didn't want to face those awkward moments of silence. David Washington was already seated at the head of the table, reviewing documents. He looked up and nodded politely as Michael entered. "Mr. Lee, please take a seat." Michael chose a chair 3 spaces away, close enough to show he wasn't intimidated, far enough to create some distance. As other executives filed in, Michael noticed how they all greeted David warmly, making easy conversation. When had his own team last spoken to him that way? Had they ever? "Let's begin," David said once everyone was seated. "I've reviewed the quarterly projections, and I have some concerns about the Asia-Pacific expansion timeline." "We've been working on that strategy for months," Michael said, unable to keep defensiveness from his voice. "The timeline is aggressive but achievable." "Is it?" David asked mildly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like we're rushing into a market we don't fully understand." Before Michael could respond, Patricia from Product Development jumped in. "Actually, I've had similar concerns. The cultural research seems incomplete." Michael stared at her. Patricia had never questioned his strategies in meetings before. "Interesting," David said. "Mr. Lee, are you sure you're in the right space with this approach? Or have you perhaps wandered into territory you don't belong in?" The room went silent. Everyone recognized the callback to the airport incident. Some looked down at their notepads, others shifted uncomfortably. "I believe my experience speaks for itself," Michael said stiffly. "Experience isn't the same as wisdom," David replied, his voice even. "Let's table the Asia-Pacific discussion for now. I'd like a more thorough analysis before proceeding." Throughout the rest of the meeting, Michael noticed a pattern. Whenever he spoke, David would somehow work in phrases like, "Are you certain about that?" Or, "Do you feel you belong in that discussion?" Each time, the words hit like small darts, reminders of that humiliating airport encounter. By meeting's end, Michael's collar felt tight around his neck. As executives filed out, he noticed how they clustered around David, eager to make good impressions. No one glanced back at Michael. When the room emptied, Michael gathered his things slowly. He felt a presence and looked up to find David watching him. "Difficult meeting?" David asked. "Just different," Michael replied cautiously. "Change is always uncomfortable," David said, "especially when you suddenly find yourself in a different position than you're used to." He left the statement hanging in the air between them as he walked out, leaving Michael alone in the conference room, surrounded by empty chairs that just weeks ago would have been filled with people waiting for his approval, his direction, his permission. Now he was just another voice in the room, and not the most respected one. 2 weeks after Horizon Ventures took over, David called an all-hands meeting in the company auditorium. Employees filled the seats, whispering among themselves about what might be coming. Rumors of layoffs and department closures had been circulating for days. Michael arrived just as the lights dimmed. He found a seat near the back, something he would never have done before. In the past, he would have been on stage, commanding the room. Now he was just another face in the crowd. David took the stage, looking comfortable and in control. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know change brings uncertainty, but I want to assure you that Horizon sees tremendous value in what you've built here." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the audience. That said, We do need to make some adjustments to align with our long-term vision. Starting today, we're launching what we call special impact projects. Each executive will lead an initiative that showcases their unique talents and demonstrates their value to our new organization. On the screen behind him, a list of names appeared paired with project titles. Michael scanned for his own, finding it near the bottom. Thomas Chen will lead our artificial intelligence development. Priya Patel will oversee the new healthcare platform. Robert Jackson will handle the government contracts division. The projects sounded impressive, with substantial budgets and staff allocations. Michael watched as his colleagues' faces lit up with pride and excitement at their assignments. And finally, David said, his voice changing slightly, Michael Lee will head our new diversity and inclusion initiative, with a special focus on accessibility and belonging in professional spaces. A few people turned to look at Michael. Someone coughed. Another person suppressed a laugh. Given Mr. Lee's apparent expertise in determining who belongs where, David continued, his tone light but pointed, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity for him to channel that energy in a more constructive direction. Michael felt his face burn. The assignment was clearly punishment disguised as opportunity. David wasn't firing him. That would be too easy. Instead, he was giving Michael enough rope to either hang himself or learn to climb. After the meeting, Michael stood alone in the hallway as colleagues rushed past, eager to start their exciting new projects. No one stopped to chat. No one met his eyes. Mr. Lee, a woman's voice called. He turned to see a tall woman approaching. She wore a bright yellow dress and carried a tablet. I'm Victoria Jackson, the diversity consultant Mr. Washington hired to assist with your project. Michael nodded stiffly. I wasn't aware I'd be working with a consultant. Mr. Washington thought you might benefit from some guidance, she said, her smile professional but her eyes assessing. He suggested we meet this afternoon to outline the project scope. I'm quite busy this afternoon, Michael said reflexively. Victoria checked her tablet. According to your calendar, you have nothing scheduled after lunch. Mr. Washington made sure of that. He said this project should be your top priority. She smiled again. He also mentioned that I should report directly to him regarding our progress. Of course he did, Michael thought bitterly. A babysitter to report his every move. Fine. 1 o'clock in my office. Actually, Victoria replied, we're meeting in conference room C. It's more accessible for the focus group participants. Focus group, Michael frowned. What focus group? The employees Mr. Washington selected to share their experiences with exclusion in professional settings. 15 people from various departments. She checked her tablet again. The email was sent to you this morning with all the details. Michael hadn't bothered checking his emails yet. He'd been too preoccupied with his fall from grace. You might want to prepare some questions, Victoria suggested. People will be sharing personal stories, including times they felt unwelcome or out of place because of how they looked or dressed. The pointed reference to the airport incident wasn't lost on Michael. David had orchestrated this entire situation perfectly. Michael would have to sit and listen to stories that would mirror what he had done to David, and he would have to act like he cared. 1 o'clock, Victoria confirmed, already walking away. Don't be late. Some of these employees are taking considerable risks speaking up. The least you can do is respect their time. Michael watched her go, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. He could treat this as the humiliation it was clearly intended to be, or he could actually try to learn something. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't sure what to do. Michael walked into conference room C 5 minutes before the scheduled focus group, clutching a coffee cup so tightly his knuckles were white. Victoria was already there, arranging chairs in a circle rather than the usual boardroom style. Good, you're early, she said without looking up. Help me with these chairs, would you? For a moment, Michael nearly refused. He wasn't used to being asked to move furniture. That was what maintenance staff was for. But something stopped him, perhaps the realization that his old ways of thinking were exactly why he was in this situation. Silently, he set down his coffee and began helping. The participants will be arriving soon, Victoria said. Remember, your job today is to listen, not defend or explain. Just listen. Michael nodded stiffly. I've led focus groups before. Victoria fixed him with a steady gaze, not like this one. she was right. As people began filing in, Michael realized this wasn't the usual hand-picked group of employees chosen for their agreeable attitudes. These 15 people represented every level of the company, from the janitor to senior developers. Most were people Michael had barely noticed before, despite working in the same building for years. "Thank you all for coming," Victoria began once everyone was seated. "Today we're discussing experiences of exclusion in professional settings. Feel free to share personal stories or observations. This is a safe space." For the first hour, Michael sat uncomfortably as people shared stories that made his stomach twist with recognition. A young programmer described being asked if she was in the right meeting when she attended a coding conference. An older administrative assistant talked about being overlooked for training opportunities because people assumed he wouldn't understand new technology. Then a maintenance worker named Lewis spoke up. "Sometimes it's not even what they say, but how they look at you, you know? Like you don't belong in certain spaces. Last month, I was fixing a light in the executive dining room, and one of the VPs actually asked me if I had permission to be there." Several people nodded in understanding. Michael shifted in his seat, remembering times he questioned maintenance staff in executive areas without thinking twice about it. "Thank you for sharing that, Lewis," Victoria said. "Michael, what are your thoughts?" Put on the spot, Michael cleared his throat. "It's unfortunate that happened." Victoria gave him a look that said his response was inadequate. "Have you ever experienced something similar?" Michael nearly said no automatically, but then a memory surfaced, one he'd buried long ago. "Actually, yes," he said slowly. "When I first started in business before I was successful, I attended a networking event at an exclusive club. I was wearing my only suit, not a very good one. The host stopped me at the door, asked to see my invitation 3 times, while waving others through without checking." "How did that make you feel?" Victoria prompted. "Small," Michael admitted, the word coming out before he could stop it. "It made me feel small." The room fell silent. It was perhaps the most honest thing Michael had said in years. After the focus group ended, Victoria handed Michael a book. "Homework," she explained. "Dr. Zora Washington's research on professional exclusion and its economic impact." Michael looked at the author's name. "Washington. Any relation to?" "His sister," Victoria confirmed. "She's one of the leading researchers in this field." David thought her work might provide valuable context for your project. Of course, Michael thought. Another layer to David's lesson. Now he would have to learn from the family of the man he humiliated. That evening, Michael sat in his empty apartment, staring at the book. He'd planned to just skim it, do the minimum required. But as he read the introduction, something changed. Dr. Washington described her own experiences of exclusion with such clarity that Michael found himself thinking of his immigrant parents, how his Chinese father had been overlooked for promotions despite working twice as hard as his colleagues, how his mother had practiced losing her accent by talking to the mirror. With a start, Michael realized he'd become exactly what his parents had faced, the gatekeeper, the person who decided who belonged and who didn't. When had that happened? When had he crossed that line? He read until 3 a.m., filling the margins with notes, questions, and for the first time in decades, genuine self-reflection. 3 months passed in a blur of focus groups, research, and late nights. Michael's office, once a shrine to his achievements with awards and golf photos covering the walls, had transformed. Charts tracking company diversity metrics replaced his trophies, books on inclusion filled his shelves, sticky notes with employee quotes covered his whiteboard. Today was the day, presentation day. Michael adjusted his tie for the 5th time as he stood in the empty auditorium, running through his slides one last time. "Nervous?" Victoria asked, appearing at his side. "I don't get nervous about presentations," Michael replied automatically, then caught himself. "Actually, yes. I'm nervous. This matters." Victoria smiled. "That's the difference. Before, you were presenting to impress. Now you're presenting to change something." Over the past months, they'd moved from reluctant colleagues to something approaching friendship. Victoria had pushed Michael harder than anyone ever had, questioning his assumptions, challenging his blind spots. He'd resisted at first, but gradually something had shifted. The auditorium doors opened as employees began filing in. Michael watched them, really saw them, in a way he never had before. The maintenance worker Lewis waved, and Michael waved back. The young programmer from the focus group gave him a thumbs up. Then David Washington entered, taking a seat at the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly, and David gave a small nod. They hadn't spoken directly about the airport incident since that first board meeting, but it hung between them like an unfinished conversation. At exactly 2 p.m., Victoria introduced Michael. The room quieted as he walked to the center of the stage. For a moment, he stood silently, looking out at the faces watching him. Then he took a deep breath. 3 months ago, I was given an assignment that I saw as punishment, he began. I was angry and resentful. I didn't think I had anything to learn about diversity or inclusion. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, surprised by his honesty. I was wrong, Michael continued. I've spent my career judging people based on narrow criteria: how they dressed, how they spoke, where they went to school. I created a company culture in my own image, and in doing so, I missed out on the full talent and potential of so many people in this room. He clicked to his first slide, showing the company demographics compared to industry standards. The gaps were obvious. These numbers tell a story, but behind each number is a person with experiences and insights we've been ignoring. Over the past 3 months, I've listened to your stories. Today, I want to share what I've learned and the changes we need to make. For the next 40 minutes, Michael outlined his findings and recommendations with a passion no one had seen from him before. He proposed mentorship programs, recruitment changes, and leadership training. He showed research linking diversity to innovation and profitability. He shared anonymous stories that illustrated the hidden barriers in their workplace. Then he paused, clicked to a blank slide, and stepped away from the podium. Before I conclude, I need to address something personal, he said, his voice quieter now. Some of you may have heard about an incident at Newark Airport 3 months ago. I publicly humiliated someone because I decided, based on his appearance, that he didn't belong in a first-class lounge. The room fell completely silent. That someone was David Washington, who is now our CEO. Michael turned to look directly at David in the back row. I judged him, embarrassed him, and tried to have him removed simply because he didn't fit my narrow idea of who belongs in certain spaces. Michael's voice wavered slightly, but he continued. Mr. Washington could have fired me. Instead, he gave me this project. He gave me a chance to learn and grow, rather than simply being punished. For that, I am grateful. Michael looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. I'm standing here today to publicly apologize to Mr. Washington and to anyone else I've made feel unwelcome or unworthy. I can't change my past actions, but I can change how I move forward. And I hope this company can move forward with me. As Michael finished, the room remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the back, David Washington stood up and began to applaud. One by one, others joined in until the entire auditorium filled with sound. Through the applause, Michael saw David give him a small, genuine nod of approval, the first real acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, redemption was possible. 1 year had passed since the acquisition. Snow fell gently outside the large windows of Ascension Tech's holiday party, covering San Francisco in a rare white blanket. Inside, the office glowed with warm lights and laughter as employees from all levels mingled freely. Michael stood by the refreshment table, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. The company looked different now, felt different. The rigid hierarchy he had once enforced had given way to something more collaborative, more inclusive. People who would never have spoken to each other under the old regime now worked together, sharing ideas and building connections. Quite a change from last year's party, Victoria said, joining him. Remember how everyone stayed in their department groups? Now look. Michael nodded. It's not just the party. The whole company is different. The numbers proved it. After implementing the changes Michael had proposed in his presentation, innovation had increased by 34%. Employee turnover had dropped to an all-time low, and applications for open positions had tripled, especially from candidates with diverse backgrounds. Michael's own position had changed too. No longer CEO, he now served as Chief Diversity Officer, a role created specifically for him after his successful project. At first, he'd seen it as a demotion. Now, he understood it was where he could make the most difference. Have you seen the latest from the Singapore team? Victoria asked, sipping her sparkling cider. They've adapted your mentorship program to account for cultural differences there. It's working even better than our version. I saw the report, Michael replied. It's exactly what we hoped for. Local teams taking the framework and improving it to fit their communities. Victoria smiled. Who would have thought a year ago that you'd be excited about something like that? Michael laughed softly. Certainly not me. Across the room, a small commotion caught their attention. David Washington had arrived, making his way through the crowd, stopping to chat with various employees. Unlike Michael's previous appearances at company events, where people had tensed up when he approached, employees seemed genuinely happy to see David, reaching out to shake his hand or share a brief conversation. I should go say hello, Michael said, feeling a familiar flutter of nervousness. Despite working together for a year, there was still a certain tension between them, not hostile, but not quite comfortable either. As Michael approached, David was finishing a conversation with a new engineer. When he saw Michael, he excused himself and moved to meet him halfway. Michael, David greeted him, extending his hand. Great party. Thank you. The social committee did most of the work. I just approved the budget. David smiled. A year ago, you would have taken full credit. Michael nodded, acknowledging the truth in that statement. I'm learning. Yes, you are. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, which is why I wanted to give you this personally. Michael took the envelope and opened it. Inside were 2 first-class plane tickets to Singapore. What's this about? He asked, confused. We're opening a new Asia-Pacific headquarters in Singapore, David explained. The team there has been doing remarkable work adapting our inclusion programs, but they need leadership to take it to the next level. Michael looked up from the tickets. You want me to visit? I want you to lead the cultural integration, David said. 6 months on the ground, building connections between our offices. It's a critical role, and I think you're the right person for it. Michael stared at the tickets, speechless. A year ago, he would have seen an international assignment as proof of his importance. Now he recognized it for what it was, trust. David trusted him to represent the company's new values. Your family is welcome to join you, of course, David added. The second ticket is for your wife. Thank you, Michael said finally, meeting David's eyes. I won't let you down. I know you won't. David held his gaze for a moment, then added softly, We've both come a long way from that airport lounge, haven't we? As they shook hands, both men recognized the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about a business trip or a new assignment. It was David's way of saying that Michael's transformation was complete, that the bridge between them had finally been built. Around them, the party continued, a visible reminder of how much had changed, and how much was still possible when people were given the chance to learn, to grow, and to become better versions of themselves.